In 1177 BCE, the most advanced civilization on Earth simply stopped. Not from one big war, not from a single enemy, but from a perfect storm of drought, migration, and supply chain failure that wiped out empires from Greece to Egypt in a single generation. Today, we're breaking down exactly how the Bronze Age world collapsed, and why the same pattern should worry us now. But to understand how the world of 1177 BCE could collapse, we have to go back a few decades. By around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was not a collection of isolated kingdoms. It was a single interconnected system. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, Cyprus, the great trading city of Ugarit. They exchanged letters. They married into each other's royal families. They sent diplomats across borders. They moved grain, copper, tin, timber, gold, and luxury goods across the sea. A king could send a message hundreds of miles away and expect another king to answer. An army could depend on materials that came from another country. A city could survive because ships arrived every season carrying the resources it could not produce itself. The world was connected, and that connection made it extraordinarily powerful, but it also created a weakness, because the entire system depended on thousands of things working at the same time. And one of the most important was bronze. Bronze requires copper and tin. The problem is that these resources do not naturally exist in the same places. Copper came from regions such as Cyprus. Tin had to be obtained through much longer and more complicated trade networks. That meant the armies, tools, weapons, and administrative systems of the Bronze Age depended on international trade continuing to function. Not occasionally, consistently. The ships had to arrive. The merchants had to travel. The roads had to remain open. The mines had to produce. The harvests had to succeed. The governments had to collect taxes. And the rulers had to keep the entire machine moving. For centuries, it worked. Then, sometime before 1177 BCE, the pressure began building, and the first signs did not look like the end of a civilization. They looked like inconvenience. Grain shipments failed to arrive. Food shortages begin appearing in records. Royal officials send increasingly desperate messages. The problem is not yet one catastrophic event. It is a series of small failures. A shipment delayed here, a harvest reduced there, a border becoming unsafe, a merchant ship disappearing, a government demanding more from farmers who already have less to give. Then something remarkable happens in Egypt. Workers building the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina stop working. They do not stop because they have suddenly become rebellious revolutionaries. They stop because they have not received the grain that forms the basis of their payment. They walk away from their work. They wait. It becomes one of the earliest recorded labor strikes in history. On its own, this does not prove that civilization is collapsing. Empires survive bad harvests. Governments survive angry workers. Cities survive shortages. But this was not an isolated shortage. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, something larger was beginning to happen. The climate was becoming less forgiving. And in the heartland of the Hittite Empire, the consequences would be devastating. The Hittites controlled one of the most powerful empires of the late Bronze Age. Their capital, Hadassa, was enormous. Their armies were powerful. Their kings had fought Egypt itself. This was a state capable of projecting power across Anatolia and the Levant. But an empire is only as strong as its food supply, and the harvests were failing. Evidence from ancient juniper trees suggests that central Anatolia experienced an extraordinary sequence of severe drought years around the end of the 13th century BCE. 3 consecutive years of extreme dryness. For an ordinary farmer, that is a disaster. For an empire, it can become a death sentence. An army needs food, a capital needs food, a government needs taxes, and taxes come from farmers. But farmers cannot pay taxes when their crops fail. And when enough harvests fail, the problem moves upward. First, the farmer suffers, then the village, then the city, then the army, then the government. The system begins losing the one thing every state ultimately needs to survive: its ability to feed itself. And while the Hittite state was weakening from within, pressure was building outside its borders. People were moving. History would eventually give some of these groups a single name: the Sea Peoples. But that name hides more than it explains. The Egyptians recorded several different groups, including the Peliset, Shurdan, Danaan, and others. They may not have been one unified people. They may not have shared one homeland. And they certainly did not leave behind a single explanation for why they were moving. What we do know is that large populations were on the move during a period of extraordinary instability. Some may have been migrants, some may have been refugees, some may have been warriors, some may have been all three. Imagine what happens when thousands of people can no longer survive where they are. They move, they search for food, they search for land, they search for somewhere their families can survive. And if the kingdoms they encounter are already starving, already weakened, already struggling to maintain their own armies and populations, the arrival of displaced people becomes another crisis layered on top of the first. Drought creates famine. Famine creates migration. Migration creates conflict. Conflict disrupts trade. Trade disruption creates more shortages, and the cycle accelerates. The system begins feeding its own collapse. Then one of the greatest empires of the ancient world disappears. The Hittite capital of Hattusa is abandoned. The city that once stood at the center of a powerful empire falls silent. There is no single final battle that explains everything. No one enemy marching through the gates and ending the empire in one dramatic moment. The political system simply stops functioning, and hundreds of miles away, another city is about to experience the same nightmare. The city is called Ugarit. For generations, Ugarit has been one of the great commercial crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean. Egyptian goods pass through its ports. Cypriot copper arrives. Aegean products move through its markets. Grain travels through its trade network. Ugarit exists because the wider system exists. And then the wider system begins breaking apart. The city's king starts sending letters, desperate letters. Enemy ships have been sighted. The coastline is under threat. He needs soldiers. He needs ships. He needs help. But the responses are not reassuring. The rulers he appeals to are dealing with their own problems. Their armies are committed elsewhere. Their coastlines are vulnerable. Their resources are limited. The network that once connected these kingdoms is still physically there, but it is no longer functioning. Ugarit's king is asking a collapsing system to save him, and the system has nothing left to give. Then Ugarit burns. The city is destroyed. Its archives are buried. Its trade network disappears. And the evidence left behind gives us something extraordinary. A civilization collapsing in real time. Not a historian writing centuries later. Not a legend passed down through generations. Letters written by people who did not know they were living through the end of their world. The final messages of a system that was beginning to fail. But the destruction of Ugarit is only one piece of the puzzle. Because what makes the collapse of the Bronze Age world so unusual is not that one city fell. It is that so many cities fell around the same time. The Hittites were collapsing. Ugarit was destroyed. The Mycenaean palace system was breaking apart. And across the eastern Mediterranean, the old political order was beginning to disappear. These civilizations had survived disasters before. The Hittites had experienced droughts. The Mycenaeans had fought wars. Egypt had survived invasions. Ugarit had recovered from previous disasters. None of these problems by themselves should have been enough to destroy the entire system. The difference was timing. The problems were arriving together. Drought weakened agriculture. Famine weakened governments. Weak governments struggled to maintain armies. Populations began moving. Migration created military pressure. Raiding disrupted trade. Trade disruption created more shortages. And governments that were already struggling to feed their populations suddenly had fewer resources to respond. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse different. It was not one disaster, it was a chain reaction. Every failure made the next failure more likely. And the very thing that had made the Bronze Age world so powerful, its interconnectedness, now became its greatest weakness. Because when one part failed, the damage did not stay local, it spread. A drought in one region could create a shortage somewhere else. A shortage could trigger migration. Migration could trigger conflict. Conflict could shut down trade routes. And when trade routes shut down, cities that depended on imported resources suddenly became vulnerable. The system had no room for failure. There was no backup, no alternative supply chain, no reserve network waiting to take over. The system worked until it didn't. And nowhere was the collapse more dramatic than in the Mycenaean world. The great palace centers of Greece, Pylos, Mycenae, Tyrants. These were not simple villages. They were administrative centers. Their palaces controlled agriculture, they collected taxes, they organized labor, they managed armies, they recorded everything on clay tablets. And then the palace system disappears. Some centers are destroyed, others are abandoned. The administrative system collapses, and with it, something else disappears. Linear B, the writing system used by the Mycenaean palaces, vanishes. For centuries, written records become almost completely absent from mainland Greece. An entire administrative civilization loses its writing system. This does not mean that every person suddenly forgot how to write. It means the institutions that had used writing, the palaces, the bureaucracies, the administrators, were gone. And when those institutions disappear, the records disappear with them. For generations, the world becomes harder to see. But one major power survives. Egypt? Barely. During the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt faces one of the most serious invasions in its history. Groups later known collectively as the Sea Peoples arrive by land and sea. But according to Egyptian records, these are not simply armies. They are moving with families, with children, with animals, with everything they own. This is important because it suggests something more complicated than a simple military invasion. These people may have been displaced. They may have been searching for somewhere to live. And they may have been willing to fight for that opportunity. Ramesses III prepares for the attack. Egyptian forces position themselves in the Nile Delta. Archers wait along the riverbanks. Ships move into the narrow channels. The Egyptians use the geography of the delta to their advantage. They do not meet the invading forces in an open battlefield. They force them into terrain where Egyptian forces have the advantage. And Egypt survives. The invasion is defeated. Ramesses III commissions massive reliefs at Medinet Habu to record the victory. For thousands of years, these images will become one of the most important sources for understanding the collapse. But there is a problem. The story was written by the winner. The monuments were commissioned by the pharaoh himself. The inscriptions celebrate his victory. The people on the other side left almost no written record explaining what happened. So when we look at the famous battle scenes at Medinet Habu, we are not looking at an objective history of the invasion. We are looking at the version of events Egypt wanted the world to remember. That does not mean the invasion was invented. It happened. Egypt really was attacked, but the exact identity of the attackers, their origins, and their reasons for moving remain uncertain. What we do know is that Egypt survives the collapse, but it survives weakened. Its territories shrink. Its resources are drained. Its influence declines. The empire that once projected power across the eastern Mediterranean will never fully recover its former reach. And when the dust finally settles, the old world is gone. The Hittite Empire has disappeared. The Mycenaean palace system has collapsed. Ugarit is destroyed. And Egypt, the great survivor, is no longer the power it once was. What follows is not recovery. It is silence. For generations, the region that once maintained diplomatic correspondence across the Mediterranean produces far fewer written records. Trade collapses. Populations contract. Cities shrink. Writing disappears from regions where it had been used for centuries. The great palace economies are gone, and the world that replaces them is smaller. This is sometimes called the Bronze Age, Dark Age. Not because nothing happened, but because so little was written down for us to find. Out of the wreckage, slowly something new begins to emerge. The peoples displaced by the collapse settle in the spaces left behind by the old empires. Groups associated with the Philistines establish themselves along the southern Levantine coast. Smaller kingdoms take root. Political power becomes more fragmented, and the old international system is replaced by something different. Even the materials of civilization begin to change. For centuries, bronze had been the foundation of warfare and technology, but iron offered one critical advantage. It did not require the same international supply network. Iron could be sourced more locally. It could be smelted locally. It could be worked without depending on the same long-distance supply of tin. The transition was gradual, but the world was moving toward a different economic model, a world less dependent on one giant interconnected system. The Bronze Age world had built an extraordinary machine, and then it discovered what happens when every part of the machine depends on every other part. So what actually killed the Bronze Age world? Historians have been arguing about that question for more than a century, and there is still no single answer. Some point to climate. The evidence from tree rings, sediments, and other environmental records suggests that severe drought affected parts of the eastern Mediterranean around the time of the collapse. The evidence is real, the timing matters. But drought alone cannot explain everything, because a drought does not automatically destroy an empire. Governments can ration food, they can move populations, they can import grain, they can survive. Unless the entire region is suffering at the same time. Others point to the sea peoples, the burned cities, the desperate letters, the Egyptian inscriptions, the movements of displaced populations. All of this suggests that migration and warfare played an important role, but the sea peoples alone cannot explain why so many different political systems collapsed across such a huge region. Others point to earthquakes, internal rebellions, economic breakdown, political instability, famine, social unrest. And perhaps the answer is not one of these things. Perhaps the question itself is wrong. Maybe the Bronze Age world did not collapse because of one cause. Maybe it collapsed because several causes arrived at the same time. Climate stress weakened food production. Food shortages weakened governments. Weak governments struggled to maintain order. Populations began moving. Migration increased conflict. Conflict disrupted trade. Trade disruption created more shortages. And the more the system weakened, the less capable it became of responding to the next crisis. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so fascinating. It was not necessarily a civilization destroyed by one enemy. It was a system that became unable to absorb shocks. And that is a very different kind of collapse. These were not primitive people. They were not stupid. They were not incapable of solving problems. They had diplomacy, literacy, international trade, sophisticated military organizations, agricultural systems that supported enormous populations, governments capable of managing resources across hundreds of miles. They had built something extraordinary. But extraordinary systems can still be fragile. In fact, sometimes their complexity is exactly what makes them fragile. The more connected a system becomes, the more efficiently it can operate. But the more connected it becomes, the more dependent every part becomes on every other part. One failure becomes two. Two become 10. 10 becomes systemic. And suddenly, the strength that made the system powerful becomes the mechanism through which the collapse spreads. 3,200 years later, our world is more interconnected than anything the people of the Bronze Age could have imagined. Our food travels across continents. Our energy systems cross borders. Our manufacturing depends on global supply chains. A single component can be designed in one country, manufactured in another, assembled in a third, and shipped across the world. We have built a system capable of extraordinary efficiency, but efficiency is not the same thing as resilience. The Bronze Age world did not collapse because its people were foolish. It collapsed because a system that had worked extraordinarily well encountered more shocks than it could absorb. And when enough pieces failed at once, the entire structure began to come apart. That is the lesson. Not that history repeats itself exactly, it doesn't. Our world is different, our technology is different, our institutions are different. But the underlying pattern is familiar. Complex systems can look invincible, right up until the moment they are tested beyond their limits. History does not always end with an invasion. Sometimes it begins with a harvest that doesn't come, a ship that never arrives, a letter that goes unanswered, a government that can no longer pay its workers, a supply chain that breaks in a place no one thought mattered, and sometimes the most advanced interconnected world on Earth does not explode. It simply stops. If you want to see more stories about the rise and fall of the world's greatest empires, subscribe to The Price of Empire. Because history doesn't just tell us how civilizations fell, it tells us what to watch for next.